remember the day I met Philip as if it was yesterday. I was still in college, working part-time as a nurse at a small clinic to pay my bills. I didn't expect to meet someone like him. Philip was not just any man, he was powerful, intelligent, and had an energy that commanded attention. At that time, he was already the CEO of a growing tech company, but he was so approachable, so kind. It was during a charity event that we first talked. He had this way of listening, making me feel as though my thoughts were the most important thing in the room. I was drawn to him immediately, but I never expected him to feel the same way about me. I was just a nurse, still finding my way in life, working hard to finish my specialization. But Philip wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. He wasn't just about the success and the corporate world, he wanted someone who could challenge him, who could make him think differently. We spent hours talking that night, and by the end of it, we both knew there was something between us. Months passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about him. Philip and I started dating, and it didn't take long for us to fall in love. He was attentive, loving, and supportive. He believed in me, even when I doubted myself. It felt like a fairy tale, having someone like him by my side. I remember our wedding day. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, a promise of forever. The first year of our marriage was everything I dreamed of. Philip was busy with his company, but we made time for each other. We would travel, enjoy quiet weekends at home, and discuss our hopes and dreams. I adored him, and he adored me. His career was booming, and I was finishing my specialization, a constant whirlwind of studying and working long hours at the hospital. But despite our busy lives, we were always there for each other. Philip supported me through the toughest moments of my studies. He'd hold me when I cried over exams or difficult patients. I felt like I could conquer anything with him by my side. Our love was intense and passionate, and I believed we were invincible. But, as the months passed, something changed. I didn't know how to explain it at first, but I felt a shift, a subtle distance that began to creep in. The more successful Philip became, the more distant he seemed at times. His focus on work, the long hours at the office, the constant travel, it took a toll on us. I tried to be understanding, but there were nights when I couldn't help but feel alone. I thought I was doing okay, even as things started to feel different between us. But then, everything changed when I met Antonio. He was a new professor for one of my classes, a renowned surgeon from Spain with years of experience. He had this intense charisma, an air of confidence that captivated everyone. Antonio was a few years older than me, but he was incredibly handsome and had this energy that made me feel like I was seen for the first time in a long time. In the beginning, it was nothing more than admiration from a distance. He was always encouraging in class, pushing me to do my best. And I did my best. I excelled in his class. I wanted him to notice me, and I think he did. There was a chemistry between us, a connection that I didn't expect. The more I interacted with him, the more I realized how alive I felt in his presence. I was torn. I loved Philip, and yet, Antonio was someone who made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, desired, challenged, seen. I began to find myself daydreaming about him. It scared me, but I couldn't help it. As the months went by, Philip became more consumed by his work. His company was expanding rapidly, and I admired his dedication, but it began to feel like I was losing him. We would have dinner, but the conversations were different, more about his work than about us. I felt like a bystander in his life, not the woman he was supposed to be sharing it with. At the same time, I was diving deeper into my specialization. My studies, combined with the hours I worked at the hospital, kept me occupied. I was learning and growing, but I couldn't deny that a part of me missed the connection we once had. I didn't know how to fix it. Philip's ambition had always been one of the things I loved about him, but now it felt like a wall between us. And there I was, spending more time with Antonio, feeling more alive than I had in months. The silence between Philip and me became almost unbearable. It wasn't the loud kind of silence, the one that fills a room when there's been an argument, but the quiet, suffocating kind. The kind that lingers even when no words are exchanged. Every night, we ate dinner together, but I couldn't help but notice how distant we had become. Philip would talk about his day, about board meetings, about strategy, about everything that mattered to him, and I would nod, offering polite responses, though my mind often wandered to other places. The passion that once filled our conversations was gone. Our connection had become like a memory I couldn't quite reach, as if it belonged to a time I had already forgotten. Philip was always tired. The work that made him so successful, so incredibly admired in the city, had taken more than just his time. It had taken his attention, his energy, his warmth. He was like a man who had built an empire but, in the process, lost the woman who once shared his dreams. I had begun to retreat into myself. I threw myself into my studies, hoping it would fill the emptiness I didn't know how to explain to him. But deep down, I knew it was no longer just about the work or the school. It was something deeper. Something I couldn't talk about, not without feeling like I was betraying him. I felt as if I were on the edge of something I didn't understand, teetering between the life I had with Philip and the pull I felt towards something I didn't even know how to name. That was when Antonio appeared. Antonio was always calm, always present. Every time I saw him, I felt a rush of something I couldn't deny. He would smile at me, and for a moment, the world would feel like it was revolving around just the two of us. He was different from Philip, and that was part of the allure. Philip was driven, ambitious, a man who lived in the future, always pushing toward the next big thing. Antonio, on the other hand, was grounded. He spoke with such conviction about life, about medicine, about the beauty of the human body. When I was with him, I felt seen, truly seen. And that was something I hadn't realized I needed until it was too late. I began to look forward to his classes, to the moments when he would turn to me, offer me a question, challenge me in a way that felt intimate. It wasn't just his knowledge, it was the way he made me feel. Alive. Engaged. In a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And yet, as I did this, I felt the weight of my actions begin to press on me. I couldn't tell Philip. I couldn't admit that I was slowly losing myself to this strange, new obsession. The guilt was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, but it was easier to ignore when I was with Antonio. Easier to pretend I wasn't slipping away from everything I had known. The first time Antonio touched me, I didn't know how to respond. It was subtle, just a brush of his fingers against mine as we looked at a medical chart together, but it was enough to send a wave of warmth through my body. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was nothing. But deep down, I felt something stir, something that had been dormant for far too long. His attention became more obvious. He would sit closer to me in class, his voice dropping to a softer tone when he addressed me, making me feel like I was the only person in the room. And I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned in, soaking up the attention like a parched plant drinking water. I had become addicted to his gaze, to the way he looked at me as if I were the most interesting thing in the room. It was like he knew exactly what I needed, what I was craving. He would compliment me on my work, on my appearance, and in return, I began to crave more. I couldn't stop myself from wanting his attention. It wasn't just the validation. It was the way he made me feel alive, powerful, like I was someone worth paying attention to. With Philip, I had become just another part of his life. With Antonio, I was someone to be noticed, someone to be admired. I found myself dressing differently, choosing outfits that were more flattering, more daring. When I entered Antonio's classroom, I felt like I was performing, putting on a show without even realizing it. I knew he was watching, and somehow, it felt good. It was a dangerous game, and I knew it, but every time Antonio spoke to me with that teasing smile, every time he looked at me like I was more than just a student, I couldn't help but want more. The tipping point came one afternoon after class. Antonio had asked me to stay after to discuss a complex case, something I had excelled at. But this time, the conversation was different. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that neither of us acknowledged at first. We spoke of the case for a few minutes, but then there was a long pause. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, and the look in his eyes made my heart race. "Do you know how beautiful you are when you're focused?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "What do you mean?" I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, and the air between us seemed to crackle with electricity. "I mean this," he said, his hand gently brushing my arm. The touch was soft, but it sent a jolt of heat through my body, and I couldn't pull away. Before I knew it, I was kissing him. It wasn't planned, it wasn't thought through, it was pure, raw desire, a moment where everything else faded into nothing. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was a betrayal of everything I had with Philip. But in that moment, I didn't care. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. That kiss changed everything. The reality of what I had done hit me as soon as the moment ended. I pulled away, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. What had I just done? How could I have let myself fall so easily into this? Antonio was different. He wasn't rushing me, wasn't demanding anything. He just looked at me with those intense eyes, and I couldn't look away. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered. "You don't have to apologize. Just let it happen." I didn't know what he meant by that. I didn't know if he meant a fleeting affair or something more. All I knew was that in that moment, with him, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long, a sense of freedom. A sense of being wanted in a way I couldn't describe. And so, it continued. Each time we saw each other, it was like a magnetic force pulling us together. We couldn't stay away. He would find excuses to be near me, to make me feel special. And I would find myself wanting more of it, more of him. Every time we kissed, every time we touched, it felt like a betrayal to Philip, but also like an escape, like I was escaping from the prison I had built in my own mind. The guilt was suffocating, but the thrill of being with Antonio was overpowering. I started to distance myself from Philip in small ways, avoiding his gaze, making excuses not to spend time with him, until it became second nature. I justified it to myself. I need this. I need to feel desired again. I need to feel alive. But in the quiet moments, when I would lay awake at night, I would feel the weight of what I was doing. I couldn't deny it. I was falling deeper into something I didn't fully understand. But the more I fell, the harder it became to stop. And that's when I knew I was already in too deep. The mornings began to blur together. I would wake up beside Philip, his face so familiar, yet I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was living two lives. I had become a master of wearing a mask. At work, I was still the dedicated, passionate nurse, always striving to be the best. But at home, I was someone else, someone who felt like an imposter in her own life. The guilt and the excitement of what I was doing with Antonio hung over me like a dark cloud, and yet, I couldn't stop it. I was in too deep. Philip had started to notice. He wasn't blind to the change. There were nights when he'd come home late from the office, his tired eyes scanning me as if trying to figure out what was going on in my head. I tried to act normal, but I could feel the tension building between us. The distance was palpable. He would ask about my day, but I could see the concern behind his questions. "How's school going, Winnie? You're working so hard lately. You sure you're okay?" Of course, I assured him I was fine. That was the lie I had been living. But the cracks in our relationship were growing wider by the day. It was on a Thursday night that the first real sign of trouble came. I had stayed late at the hospital, my shift running long. But there was something else on my mind. Antonio had asked me to meet him for a drink after class, and I couldn't say no. I had told Philip I was staying late to study, but the truth was, I was meeting Antonio again. The thrill of it was almost intoxicating. I knew it was wrong, but with every stolen moment, it felt like I was feeding an addiction I couldn't shake. I didn't know that Philip had been suspicious for weeks, watching my behavior shift, seeing how my attention seemed to slip away from him, how my eyes no longer lit up when he spoke. He had begun to follow me, quietly, cautiously. He didn't confront me outright. Not yet. But he had been watching. That night, I left the hospital, my heart racing with anticipation, excitement, and the weight of my lies. I drove towards Antonio's place, my thoughts only on him, on the passion, on the connection that had become impossible to ignore. I had no idea that Philip was behind me, quietly trailing in his car, trying to piece together the fragments of my disappearance. His suspicions were growing into something more. He needed answers, but he didn't yet know what they would cost. I turned onto the familiar street that led to Antonio's apartment, my heart thumping louder with every passing second. I parked my car just outside the building, the same spot I had parked so many times before. But this time felt different. I didn't know why, but I felt the tension in my body heighten. As I stepped out of the car, I glanced around, only to catch a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. It was Philip. My stomach dropped. My body froze. I didn't know how long he had been following me, but in that moment, everything felt like it was crashing down. My entire world teetered on the edge of something I couldn't control. I walked toward Antonio's door, my steps slow, deliberate, but my mind was racing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I saw that it was a message from Philip. "I'm outside. We need to talk." I stared at the message, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I knew what was coming. I couldn't ignore it anymore. He had figured it out. He had seen enough. And yet, I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back now. I knocked on Antonio's door, and the moment he opened it, his warm smile met mine. "You're late," he murmured, pulling me into a kiss. But it didn't feel like it used to. Something inside me shifted, something darker, more guilty. As I kissed him back, I felt the weight of the truth pressing down on me. That's when I heard it, a door slam. Philip was here. The moment I heard the door slam, the world seemed to slow. Antonio pulled away from me, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. I knew it wasn't supposed to happen this way. My life wasn't supposed to come apart in front of me like this. But there was Philip, standing in the doorway, his face a mixture of anger, disbelief, and deep hurt. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see everything in them: betrayal, confusion, and an unbearable sadness. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he looked between me and Antonio, his fists clenched at his sides. His jaw was tight, his whole body radiating tension. I felt the heat of his gaze burn into me like a physical thing. It was as if he could see right through me, to the heart of everything I had been hiding. "Winnie," he finally said, his voice low and tight, "is this really how far you've gone? Is this really who you are now?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. How could I explain what I had done? How could I explain the desperation, the longing, the feeling of being trapped in a life that no longer felt like my own? I wanted to tell him how sorry I was, how much I loved him, how I was lost in something I couldn't control. But the words didn't come. There was no easy way to make this right. "Philip," Antonio's voice broke through the silence, cool and calm, but his words were a slap in the face. "This is between us now. You don't belong here." The audacity of Antonio's words stunned me. I had never seen him like this, so sure of himself, so certain that he had a claim on something that wasn't his. It wasn't supposed to be like this. This wasn't how I imagined it. Philip's expression darkened. His eyes moved from Antonio back to me. "Is this what you wanted, Winnie?" he asked, his voice shaking now, the hurt more apparent. "Is this what you really wanted? To throw everything away for someone else?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My heart was breaking, but I couldn't stop myself from looking at Antonio, my other reality, the one that felt so thrilling, so full of everything I thought I had been missing. But then, looking at Philip, seeing the pain in his eyes, I realized the weight of what I had done. And suddenly, it wasn't just about me. It was about everything I had destroyed. Before I could respond, Philip pushed past Antonio, his rage evident now, but his voice was quieter, more controlled. "I don't know who you are anymore," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "I thought I knew you, but I was wrong. I was a fool to believe that you would never hurt me. I gave you everything." His words sliced through me like a knife. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fix what I had broken. Antonio, still standing there, looked at Philip for a long moment, his stance defensive, but calm. "You're right about one thing," he said softly. "She was never really yours." The finality in Antonio's words hit me harder than anything Philip had said. It was like a slap in the face, a reminder of just how much I had lost. In that moment, I knew that whatever was left between Philip and me had already been shattered beyond repair. What I had done was unforgivable, and Antonio was right. I had chosen. I had made my decision, and now there was no going back. I turned to Philip, but he was already walking out the door. "Don't follow me," he said, his voice hoarse. "I can't look at you right now." I watched him leave, the pain in his back as he turned away from me like a dagger to my heart. I wanted to run after him, to scream and beg for him to forgive me, but I couldn't. I had no right to ask for that. Antonio stood silently, watching everything unfold. I didn't know if he was sorry or if he was simply indifferent. But at that moment, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the reality of what I had done, and the wreckage I had left behind. And I realized, with a bitter sense of finality, that my life had changed forever. I stood at the window of Antonio's apartment, staring out at the city. The divorce papers had been signed. Philip was gone. Our marriage was over. I could still feel the weight of everything I had done, of how I had betrayed him, and how, despite my feelings for Antonio, I wasn't sure what I was looking for anymore. Philip had left quietly, his eyes hollow with pain. He didn't fight me on the divorce. He didn't beg me to stay. I couldn't bear to watch him leave. I had already betrayed him too much, and I knew there was nothing left between us. What we had, what we'd once been, was gone. We had simply outgrown each other, or maybe we had never truly seen each other for who we really were. That night, Antonio held me as I stared out into the city. His presence was comforting, but it didn't fill the emptiness inside me. I thought that leaving Philip for Antonio would bring me clarity, would give me a fresh start. But now I wasn't so sure. It was like I had traded one uncertainty for another. "I'm sorry," I whispered to myself more than to him. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Antonio didn't respond. He never did when I said things like that. He simply held me, like he always had. But holding me didn't solve anything. It didn't take away the guilt that sat heavy on my chest, the loss of everything I had known. The truth was, I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if I could ever heal from the destruction I had caused in both Philip's life and my own. I had walked away from a life I thought I wanted, only to find that leaving wasn't the answer. Antonio had been a temporary escape, a distraction from the unhappiness I had been feeling, but now I was facing the consequences of my choices. I thought of Philip, of the man I had loved once. I thought of what he must be going through, how he was trying to rebuild his life without me. And for a brief moment, a pang of regret hit me, sharp and painful. But I knew there was no going back. I had signed those papers. I had made my choice. As I turned away from the window and looked at Antonio, I realized that even though I had left one life behind, I was still searching for something that I wasn't sure would ever fill the hole I had created. There was no perfect answer, no happily ever after. Just the quiet reality that life had to continue, even if I didn't know where it was leading me. And so, here I was, alone in my own way, standing at the threshold of a new life, unsure of what came next. But I couldn't undo what I had done, and there was nothing left but to keep moving forward.
If you like this story and felt connected, please subscribe. Thanks for watching Gaby's cheating stories. See you on the next one.